About the cemetery. It was established here in the 1850s on land that was part of a Mexican land grant. We don't know exactly when, but it was donated for use as a cemetery by a pioneer and land grant recipient, John B. Watson, just prior to his sale of the remaining portion of the land to August Hemme. This valley's human history began about 5,000 years ago when the Miwoks and the Tatkins lived here until Spanish explorers came in 1769. They arrived in Danville in 1772. From their diaries, we know the Spaniards camped on the banks of the San Ramon Creek as they were establishing missions throughout the state. Today, you'll see, among many others, the gravestone of the first recorded burial here, that of Callie Chrisman in 1856. She unfortunately was quite young. However, there was at least one earlier burial, that of a guy named Thomas Monroe, who died while traveling here in a survey party in 1838. Problem is, nobody knows exactly where he's buried. This is a fairly quiet part of Danville and Alamo. In the 1850s, though, it was very active. Mary Ann Jones, one of the area's outstanding pioneers, whose grave you'll see on the tour, was one of the organizers who wrote, "People came from every place in reach." Another pioneer, James Smith, recalled that the meetings were full of religious fervor and included 3 daily services, 4 or 5 preachers, and baptisms in the valley's swimming hole on San Ramon Creek. We think that swimming hole is located just across the creek from here. Kids and sometimes adults today still go down to that swimming hole, and
my sisters and I used to swim in that hole.
Wow.
During all of this was happening, there was another thing happening, and that was called the Civil War. The residents, because of the schools, the churches, the cemetery, and the Danville Grange, helped keep people together so that they got through the Civil War without declaring war on each other. We're going to stop at various grave sites for a quick history of some individuals and families buried here. In some cases presented by dedicated volunteers who tell the stories of the pioneers buried here. We give a special thanks to those volunteers: Kim Crow, Gail Kamerer, Loucy and Gary DeAtley, Carmen Curtis, and Ed Engel, whose presence and presentations add so much to the flavor of this whole thing. We also want to thank Marilyn's sister Susan for helping pass out brochures and collecting donations, which do go directly to the museum.
The Stone Valley and Stone Valley Road were named for members of the Stone family who came from Iowa and arrived in California in the 1850s. They gravitated to our valley, and one stone after another purchased land in the part where it is Stone Valley, where Stone Valley Road is. Silas and Susanna Ward Stone came to California in 1853, settling in Alamo with a large wagon train captained by their son Albert Stone. Silas was tall and dignified, and he was the area's alcalde, which is a Mexican position similar to a judge mayor. Thus he became known as Squire Stone. Their son Albert, a wagon master, was called Colonel because of his renown as a, quote, Indian fighter, which is not particularly politically correct, but history is messy. Albert returned to California with his second wife, Martha Smith Stone, in 1858, and they raised 7 children in Alamo near Green Valley. One night, Albert's son accidentally set fire to their Green Valley house with a candle while looking for something in a closet. Many things still in packing boxes were saved, but their money, in the form of gold, melted and leaked through the cracks in the floor. Fortunately, it was later recovered and minted again. Albert and Martha eventually owned 1,200 acres in Alamo with hay, grain, cattle, horses, sheep, and hogs. He was a charter member of the Danville Grange in 1873. Silas and Susanna built a house in 1855 just off Stone Valley Road on Austin Lane, where it has stood for over 170 years. The Stones were strong supporters of education. Colonel Albert built a cabin on his ranch to use as a school for his children, and neighbors, and Silas Stone was one of the first trustees of the area's first high school, the Union Academy, which was just across the boulevard here and burned down only 8 or 9 years after it was erected, so they tried. At the front of the Alamo Cemetery, right over here, is the Padva family plot. You might recognize the name Padva from a couple of houses in Danville using that name. Adolphus Padva, who is right there in the middle, came here from Canada. You're going to hear that the people came from everywhere. We have family up here from Germany and Canada and Missouri and what have you, so you'll hear a lot of places that they came from. He came here in the 1880s. He married Mary Alma McPherson, whose family came here soon after the gold rush, with a going across the plains in a Buffalo Bill party. Adolphus and Mary had 3 sons. The Padva's first house was originally built by Presbyterian minister Reverend Joshua Chase Burgess and was called Bonnie Vista, with its views of Mount Diablo and the valley. Adolphus and Mary bought the house and 20 acres where the Danville livery is right now, and it became known as the Padva House. It was a grande dame of a house with 8 rooms, a barn, and orchards. They sold the house to their son Roger in 1911, where it stood proudly for decades. In 1980, the house was moved and restored to the business medical offices still located on Padva Road near livery. Padva House is there. Roger Padva had a butcher shop in Danville and served on the Danville Fire District Board. He married Ruby Oswell, a daughter of pioneers who was Danville's postmistress from 1933 to 1963, with quite possibly the longest tenure of any postmistress in the area. The Padva's other house, known as their townhouse, which is rather funny because it's less than a mile from the other house, is the Shuey Padva House. It is a Victorian Italian built around 1891, and it stands at the corner of School Street and Harts Avenue in Danville. It is now set up as an office workspace.
I am Ruth Boone. I was born in Duluth, Minnesota in 1904. When I was about 10 years old, our family moved to Hollywood by way of Oregon because my father was ill and needed better weather than in Minnesota, as you can imagine. Okay, so we moved to Hollywood. I went to the Hollywood School for Girls, where I was interacting with many famous people and little girls, daughters of many famous people. Okay, so while I was in Hollywood, I met a bright, ambitious young man by the name of Bud or Travis Moore Boone, who is buried here. I called him Bud. He was in Hollywood to sell tiles, handmade, beautiful handmade tiles. He was from the San Ramon Valley. Here I am when I was in Hollywood. His parents, Numa and Minnie Boone, they lived down in San Ramon on a farm. We had a very successful courtship down there. We decided to get married. Well, back then I hadn't met the parents yet, the family yet, his sister Eleanor and his parents, Minnie and Numa. So we decided we'd take a trip up to San Ramon and visit the parents and meet the parents. Well, Bud said, let's get married on the way. So we stopped in Merced where we got a license. Unfortunately, there was a 3-day wait on the license, but we got the license and decided to go on to farm. Well, when we were on the farm, Minnie said to Bud, you better not get married anytime soon. Well, we went back to Merced and we got married. Well, it appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle, the announcement, and one of Minnie's friends called her and said, congratulations. Well, she didn't know anything about it. So after that, Eleanor called Travis and said, I want to know if you're married. And when he said yes, she hung up on him. On October 9th, 1929 is when we got married. Well, something happened in October of 1929, the depression, the stock market crash. Bud lost his job. We had to come back to San Francisco. He got a job as a salesman for Fuller Brush. Pretty soon, Numa was threatened with bankruptcy, and he had to quit his job. We had to move back to San Ramon, to the farm, to the Dutch colonial house where we never left. Okay, it was really difficult during the Depression. The only way we made ends meet is selling grapefruit marmalade, orange marmalade, chili sauce, and various jams and jellies out on the street. That's the only cash we made. My father-in-law got very ill and couldn't do anything. So we took over the farm. Like I say, there was 365 acres. We had beets, sugar beets. We had beefsteak tomatoes. We had walnuts. Walnuts was the biggest crop in Contra Costa County until the 50s. The way that they would get walnuts off a tree is they had this long stick. It was like a bamboo stick with a big rubber mallet on the end of it. And they would, my neck hurts just looking at this. They would knock the walnuts off. The walnuts would fall down and they pick them up. Huge job. Bud said, you know, why don't we hire some of the workers' wives, because there were so many walnut trees, to help pick up the walnuts. Well, they were delighted because they could make some extra money. I organized a wives group. So for 10 years, and I was part of the wives group, we went around not only to our farms all over the valley, to Livermore, all over, and picked up walnuts. During the Depression, we hired kids during the summer to pick up walnuts. Bud was deputized to hire prisoners to pick up the walnuts. And this was during the war too. Bud was very inventive young man. And so he invented this thing. It was a tower. Instead of having this big old pole that you break your neck on, he had a tower with oil drums that were placed along the tower. And a man would stand in the oil drums and beat the trees at different levels. You know, when I was in Hollywood, I never thought I'd be picking up walnuts off the ground after going to a girls' school with famous people. But there I was.
Robert O., or known as R.O., was the first Baldwin settler in the valley in 1852. I'd like to introduce you to Ed Engel, who will talk about the Baldwin family.
Okay, so Robert, or R.O., was a really one of the first movers and shakers in the Danville area. He was a very shrewd and opportunistic young man. His story starts in a farm in Ohio. He was born one of 10 children. And when he was 22 years old, obviously there weren't going to be very many opportunities for a guy that's 22 years old on a small farm. So he got together with, there were 8 young men that got together. And as young men in the Midwest at that time, you go west, right? So he got 8 guys together, including his brother and his best friend, Charles Meese. And Charles Meese is buried up in the next lot. They were together pretty much their whole lives. So they got together and started out from Missouri in March of 1850. When they got to Salt Lake City, they made a decision to ditch their wagons because the rest of their trip was pretty much desert and mountains the whole time. So they ditched their wagons and they got to Placerville, California in July of 1850. So they stayed in Placerville for the remainder of 1850, and in 1851 they went to the Feather River area, which is east of Marysville, if you're not sure where that is. And they were there all of 1851, and I guess they were pretty successful because in 1852 they visited the San Ramon Valley here and decided this was the Garden of Eden. So They moved here in October of 1852. Robert was opportunistic because he decided he was going to be a squatter, okay? So he didn't pay for the property. He just moved in and said, this is mine. So squatting was a problem at that time. This area was controlled by those Castro Pacheco people. They lived in Martinez. They didn't live here. By 1852, this was a state. The law enforcement wasn't very good. So they were able to move in and declare they lived there and nobody was going to kick them off. In fact, squatting at that time was so bad that General Amador had the southern section, and he got so frustrated with squatters he couldn't keep them off, so he sold his property. He sold the northern part to Lynch and Norris, if you're familiar with those names, and the southern portion he sold to Doherty. I'm sure you're familiar with Doherty Valley, okay? So, and then he moved his family to the foothills. I guess he was very successful because there's a town of Amador and a county of Amador up there, and they're named after him. Okay, so R.O. moved into this area. It's 1853. He's 25 years old. He's in 3 years he's moved from Ohio to California. He's made some money in the gold fields. He's moved to his Garden of Eden, and he's got some property to farm. In 1853, things even turned out better because a family called Cox moved in just south of Meese, and they had 5 daughters that were unmarried. So things even got better. So one of the daughters' name was Mary. She was only 15 at the time. In 1858, when she was 20, they got married. So Mary had 6 children. They were married 50 years. R.O. was a progressive and inventive farmer. When he moved into the farm, he grew wheat, and wheat was a great crop to raise here. You know, if you look up in the hills, there's still wild wheat growing up there, right? You plant it in the fall, rains a little bit, the stuff sprouts and sits there all winter long. And in the late winter and early spring, it rains and the weather warms up. The crop grows and matures, and in June, this stuff is all going to be golden brown, right? So that's when you would harvest it. So his other big crop was hay, and that was a big money crop because at that time, if you wanted transportation, you had to have a horse. So he had a ready market for his hay. So one of the problems, though, was there were no fences. The Pacheco and Castro family ran cattle through this valley. So if you're raising hay or wheat, you're not going to have a very good crop if you've got animals running through eating your crop. So there were no fences because there were no steel factories in California in 1850. So what he did was he inherited or imported a bunch of Osage trees from the Midwest, and I'm from the Midwest. We had the properties were differentiated or separated by Osage trees. So he got a bunch of Osage seeds, planted them. They make a great fence. They grow very fast. You can, if you have a hedge made out of Osage trees, it's almost impenetrable. So a large animal is not going to get through an Osage hedge. So anyway, that's what he used for fencing. So he started with 165 acres, and by the time he quit farming in the late 1800s, he farmed over 800 acres. The other thing he did was what was going on in the 1850s was farmers started to plant fruit and nut trees. You just heard about all the walnut trees. So if you're a farmer and you can plant a tree and get a crop for 25 years without having to plow the field, that's a great deal, okay? So he planted fruit and nut trees during that period. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about his civic duties or civic things. He was a real civic booster, okay? So he wrote newspaper articles for the local newspaper talking about how great the valley was. He was a trustee of the local Danville Grammar School. He was a trustee for the Presbyterian Church. He was the president of the San Ramon Valley Bank for a while. And probably his biggest contribution was he got the railroad built. He helped get the railroad built. He went around, it was a committee that was formed of the various farmers, and they went around to all the people who would have been involved in the right-of-way for the railroad and got them to either donate their piece of their property or sell for a very small amount so that the railroad could be built. And the railroad then was built in 1891, and because he had been very influential in getting that built, they made a stop for him called Osage Station. And if you're familiar with Osage Park or Baldwin School or Baldwin Drive, that's his legacy, okay? He was a very influential guy at the time. And he ended up dying in 1908, and his wife died in 1914, and they are buried here.
Jones family members were some of the earliest American settlers in Alamo, arriving in 1851. They're living in San Jose, and I'm going to introduce you to Mary Ann Jones.
Welcome. My name is Mary Ann Jones. I was born in Tennessee in 1825. My father was a very talented farmer. He had lots of acreage, and we had a very nice life. But he got that call that said, "Go west, young man, go west." And that meant Missouri. So we packed up our wagon and we went to Missouri. After we got to Missouri, we again became farmers, and we were well off, and we did very well in farming. Unfortunately, my mother passed away. I was in charge of the rest of the children in the family, being the eldest, and then my father remarried. My stepmother and I did not get along very well, and I was 16, 17 years old, and next door in the big acreage, there was a very handsome looking young man, and before long, we became acquainted and we got married. We lived on his acreage and we did very well as farmers, and we had 2 little girls. But again, my husband got that call, "Go west, young man, go west." And that meant California or Oregon. So we joined a wagon train and we left in 1846 across the land in our wagon train with our family. And we had a very successful trip. The Indians were not a bother to us. We knew what they wanted and they knew what we wanted. And so we got along quite well. We did lose 50 head of cattle over a stream, a raging river one time, which was a big loss to us, but we traveled on. Coming up the coast, we came to a sign at Fort Hall that said, "Little food or water for the next few days," and we were going to Oregon. The rest of the trail was going to California. We went a day or two up that trail and decided that a snowflake in the air, my husband looked at me and I looked at him and he said, "Let's go to California." So we turned the wagon train around and we went back down and came across the Donner Party. They invited us to stay with them, but there were snowflakes in the air. The Donner Party was having a problem. One of their people had a very bad situation. They were off tracing him and chasing him down to bring him back. We decided that we'd better just go on. We missed the same fate as the Donner Party by 2 days. So we were very fortunate. We were coming into California, and of course it was now wintertime, and we knew friends in the Childs Ranch in Napa. So we went to their ranch. Oh, I forgot to say I was pregnant with my 3rd child all the way across. So we stayed there with the Childs family at the ranch for 6 months. Our daughter, little Josephine, was the first little girl born in America in 1847. And so we were having a nice time at the Childs Ranch, but it was time for us to move on. In June, we came down to go to San Jose, where we also had more family and friends. As we were coming through this valley, my husband said, "Stop the train. We're going to live here someday. This is the most beautiful place I have ever seen in my life." Well, we went on down to San Jose and we spent several years down there regrouping, trying to decide where we were going to live and what we were going to do. We ran a boarding house. We went to the gold country and we tried panning for gold, but the little girls and I were sick most of the summer. It was cold and it was wet and we didn't make much money. So we came back. By this time, we were ready to come back up to this land. In 1852, we came back up to buy 1,000 acres here in this beautiful area and settle down in our ranch. Well, we soon knew that we needed to have a post office because the only post office was Martinez and San Jose. So my husband became the postmaster, I became the postmistress, and the post office was in our house. You would come once a week to collect your mail, or you'd bring me your dime to mail your letter, but you'd stay and talk. Well, I said, talked, and somebody else would come and you would talk. Finally, I had to say, go home. I have work to do. This is my house. Well, by now we have, oh, by the way, we are upwards of 9 children now, so we need a school. So we hired a schoolmaster who also boarded with us and formed the first schools. And a few years later, of course, we needed a church. And so we got a minister, but we had no place to meet and we had no congregation. So I had all of your addresses. So I wrote you a letter and we went down by the creek and we spent 10 days in camp. And at the end of the 10 days, we had 10 families that signed up to form the Cumberland Presbyterian Church. And it was the only Protestant church in the entire county. Well, we now have our school, we have our church, and now we have our social, the Masons formed a group. And my husband joined the Masons. They were very active in helping out, not the women, but the men. So by this, the 1860s are coming along. These are political years. It was very politically unrest in, and the women's rights were being questioned. We women kept voting for things, and we kept being voted down. So the majority of the men always got their way. We came up into the 1870s, 68s, where the Grange was formed and the Masons were formed. My husband then passed away in 1870. Unfortunately, I was left with three boys to raise all the things that we had on our 1,000 acres. But in the meantime, we had ups and downs with our property. We had lost it several times because of the land grant, and we were not sure who the real owners were, but we ended up getting our land back. My oldest 2 sons went out to work for other farmers so we would have some money, and my youngest son stayed on the ranch to help me out. The Grange was formed in 1878, and we had the Grange to join all the families in the area for the farmers' rights so that we would get together to get our crops. Well, it wasn't long before the women tried to get our women's suffrage rights at the Grange Hall, and we kept being voted down again. So unfortunately, the women didn't get any rights until about 1911. California women really had a right to vote. I was the happiest day in my life when I was able to register as a voter, and I was 18. In 1914, I was able to vote. I was so pleased that I was able to do something that I had worked for almost all of my life. Well, I'm in my 90s now, and I'm getting rather old, and I think I'm going to have to let the rest of my young people carry on for now. I hope you'll have time to read my story someday, and I hope you enjoyed learning about Marianne Jones. Thank you.
The Bollinger family, their familiar landmarks, I know, Bollinger Canyon Road and what have you. Joshua Bollinger, who is this man right here, was born in Bollinger County, Missouri, so the Bollingers must have had great influence back there. He had 5 children with his first wife in Missouri and 7 children with his second wife, Catherine, so he was very prolific. He migrated to California in 1850. Is there a common thing here? Everybody's coming out for the gold rush, where he mined and farmed. Joshua returned to Missouri briefly and married Catherine in 1854. Joshua and Catherine moved to Santa Clara and then moved to the San Ramon Valley in 1855 and taking up residence in the canyon that now bears his name. In 1866, he bought a farm of 283 acres in Alamo, where he was evidently quite prosperous. His son Joseph remained in the canyon property. Bollinger Canyon from Crow Canyon Road, they dead ends in Las Trampas Regional Park right now, but at that point there was a road all the way to through the canyon to Moraga, and if you know the little town of, I think it's called Canyon, where all the redwoods, that's where they cut down a lot of the redwoods that built these homes that are still standing today. So that was a really important resource for them to build their houses here. So anyway, but it's interesting to think, I've done that hike and it's a long way through a lot of hills and what have you, that they actually had a road that went through there.
This is the first known gravesite here in the cemetery, that of 6-year-old Callie Chrisman. She died in 1856. There's a lot of graves throughout this cemetery of young people who didn't survive the way they can survive today. We don't know a lot about her or her family, but we do know that her parents, who were John and Barbara, arrived in Danville in 1851 and are counted as two of the valley's original pioneers. They had two sons and another daughter besides Callie. They lived a number of places near today's San Ramon Valley High School in Danville. They lived in Green Valley and at 169 Front Street in what's now called the Cohen Vecchi house, if you know what that is. That house was built in 1866 by a man named Michael Cohen, who had a general merchandise store on Front Street. Originally, it was a Gothic revival design, but with decorative trim under a central pointed gable and all that Gothic does. The house was moved closer to Front Street in 2001 and has a San Ramon Valley Historical Society plaque on the front.
You can see in this beautiful ornate gravesite, this is a plaque from the first Humburg to move here. And then over to this corner are descendants. Sometimes early American settlers get lost when people write about community beginnings. Much has been written about the Jones and Stones of Alamo, the Baldwins, the Loves, the Woods in Danville, and the Norris, Harlan, and Glass families of San Ramon. I want to introduce you to one of the earliest, most successful pioneering families in the valley. Surrounded by this ornate fencing, this plot holds the history of the family of Friedrich and Maria Humburg. At the age of 26, Friedrich Lorenz Humburg set off from his home in Kessel, Germany for New York. Then he left for the Pacific and the gold fields of California. He first worked in the mines. Then when the gold did not pan out, he saw the possibility of a new life in the San Ramon Valley. On a visit from Germany, Maria Kornmann came to the valley to visit her sister, who was married to Henry Hoffman, owner of the San Ramon Hotel in Alamo. Maria and Friedrich met and soon married. They lived in Alamo for 13 years, then returned to Germany. We have no idea why. In 1879, they came back and settled here for good. He purchased 116-acre ranch where they raised their two children, August and Friedrich L. Lawrence Jr. Here is a photo of the Humburg house overlooking Alamo toward Las Trampas. And you can make out their house, and the Jones Ranch is up here. August Humburg loved racing his trotting horse, Humburg Bell, at the Oakwood racetrack. If you take this road and curve around and go up toward past Hat McGee Park and you get to the fence, but if you could get up to the top, that's where the original racetrack in Alamo was. It was a small community, and the Humburgs became linked in marriage to other well-known families, including the Stones from Alamo and the Olsons from San Ramon. August wed Annie Alice Stone in 1893, and they had two children, Friedrich and Lawrence. Here is a photo of August with his horse and buggy. August built 3 homes in the center of downtown Alamo, one for him and his wife, one for his mother, and another for his family in 1920 on a knoll along Highway 21. That home was razed in 1967 and replaced by the first Safeway. Once also the site of the first Alamo post office during the 1850s. And here is a picture of one of the houses that August built. This one was on Orchard Court, and it was moved from its original site closer into Alamo to Orchard Court, which is still in existence right down the street. Lorenz married Astrid Olson, who was from another pioneering family and graduated in 1914 with the first all-girl graduating class of San Ramon Valley High School. Lorenz and Astrid had 2 daughters, Norma and Betty. Norma and Betty both remained actively involved in the valley's history and the Museum of the San Ramon Valley for many years. The Humburgs owned over 700 acres in Alamo, including much of today's downtown. on the east side of today's Danville Boulevard. The property at Alamo Square Drive and along Stone Valley Road continues to be in Hamburg descendant hands. Here is something about Lawrence that was just fascinating. In the 1870s, a state law was passed declaring the ground squirrel a public nuisance. Squirrel eradication was a major goal of the new California Granges in 1873, since all owners of property had to work together to control squirrel infestations. One report in 1918 said that 3 pairs of squirrels in 3 breeding seasons could produce 640 squirrels. Rancher Lawrence Hamburg became one of the county's 5 squirrel inspectors and was well known to all of the ranchers and farmers in the San Ramon, Sycamore, and Tasajara valleys. Informally they called him the Squirrel Man. He would pick up his supplies in Pleasant Hill, trailer his horse to a site, then ride into the fields and hills and smoke squirrels out with bisulfide or spoon poisoned barley into squirrel holes, using special saddlebags for the poisoned barley. Alamo's Hamburgs were involved in all aspects of the community, from being school trustees, ranchers, teachers, members of the Women of Woodcraft, the Alamo Women's Club, and the Odd Fellows Fraternal Order, and founders of the Museum of the San Ramon Valley. Descendants still live here today, a family worth remembering.
Well, I am so excited that you came to see me today. I am just really excited. I'm Charlotte Wood, and I was born in 1864. And I have 2 brothers and 1 sister, and I grew up on the Wood Ranch. My father was a rancher and a farmer, and he was an expert. And when I got old enough, I went to the Sycamore School, and I was there until 8th grade, and then I left, and later on I went to San Francisco and I got more education and I became a teacher. And I taught at the Sycamore School for 31 years. For 31 years, I was in one room with 8 grades. I taught 8 grades in one room. And many people said, "How did you do that?" Well, the day before, I would write the assignments on the board, usually a chapter in the McGuffey Reader, and then I would put math problems on the board and other assignments, and I would start off working with the younger children, the 1st graders and 2nd graders, who did not know how to read or write. And so I would start off with them. And then usually later in the day, I would have the older kids work with some of the younger kids. Now, there were rules for teachers in those days. You couldn't be married. But of course, I could have been married. We had a young man, Thomas, who came over from England, who wanted to be a rancher. And who was the best person to teach him? My dad. So he stayed with us for a couple of months. One night, Thomas and I were in the parlor, and Thomas said to me, he said, "Miss Charlotte," he said, "I've become very fond of you, and I would like to marry you and have you come back to England and help me start the ranch." And I said, "Oh, Thomas," I said, "I am so flattered, but I can't leave my family. I can't leave my students. I can't leave my ranch." So Thomas, of course, went back to England, and we heard from him, and he did start a ranch. And there were some people felt sorry for me because I didn't have any children. I had hundreds of children. My brothers used to drive me into Danville to go shopping, and I would hear, "Miss Latte, Miss Latte." That's what the children used to call me. And so they would run up to me and hug me, and I would hug them. You realize I had some of those children for 8 years. I had them for 8 years, so I grew very fond of those children. And another rule is you could not be seen, a single teacher could not be seen in a bathing costume. Well, for crying out loud, there was not an ocean close by, so I didn't even need to have a bathing costume, and I probably didn't even know how to swim. Then there was another rule that you could not be seen with a man who was not your father or your brother. Well, I was lucky because I had 2 brothers and a father, and so if I needed to go somewhere, I could go with one of them, and they would often take me into Danville to shop. My father was the best rancher and farmer, and so he started a club called the Grange. And that's where farmers and ranchers would come together and they would help each other. And I could join. And I joined at 17 years old. Now, I couldn't vote until 1920, but I could join the Grange. Women could join the Grange. And I became the poet laureate. And I'm going to read you one of my poems because I was good. It's called Tiny Butterflies. We are tiny butterflies, bowing gracefully to you. We fly from flower to flower, all sparkling fresh with dew. Soon in the ruddy sunlight, we flutter here and there, then softly sink to slumber and say our evening prayer. In the morning we awaken at the tender kiss of day to dance among the sunbeams and hide and seek to play. Before we nestle gently within some tempting bloom to sip its luscious nectar and inhale its rich perfume. The Sycamore School closed in 1927. There were only a few students there, and the parents felt they would get a better education if they went into Danville and had separate classes for each grade. And after the school closed, a family moved in and it became a family home. But in 1945, it burned down. And I can't tell you, I cried for weeks over that, a place where I had spent 31 years, and it burned down. In 1940, I got a call from the San Ramon Unified School District, and they said, Miss Wood, we're going to name a school after you. I said, what? He said, we're going to name a school after you. It's going to be called the Charlotte Wood Middle School. Oh my gosh. And so in a few weeks later, they called me up and they said, you have to come over and cut the ribbon. So I went over there and I cut the ribbon. And I'm telling you, I was so proud. I am so proud to have a school named after me. I died in 1961. And I was 97 years old. I had the best life. I had a wonderful family. I loved my ranch. I loved my teaching. To have a school named after you, what could be better than that?
Everyone here has come from somewhere else. As a matter of fact, in 1776, there were 300,000 indigenous people in this area from here down to Monterey. Within 10 years of the Spanish coming and populating this area, that population went down to less than 50,000 people. And so the people who are here now, like me and like so many of you and so many of us, came from someplace else, which is exactly how James Close got here. James Close came here from Toronto, Canada, believe it or not. Now, how did he know to come to Danville? To be honest with you, we don't know. But he did. He came to Danville, and he did not come necessarily for the gold rush. He wasn't up mining, but he came here with $1,100 in gold coin. And when he got here in 1875, he purchased from Dan Inman. Dan Inman and his brother were part of the gold rush in mining. They got here in 1858 and bought 400 acres, and Dan Inman and his brother actually founded the town of Danville. James got here later and paid Dan Inman $1,100 in gold coin for a blacksmith shop, a small building, and a house. And where it was is, if you're familiar with Danville, do you know where Prospect Street is? And there's a chocolate shop on the corner, and there's a restaurant on the other side, and there's the Bevmo on Diablo Road. That is the land that James Close purchased for $1,100. James bought his blacksmith shop, and James became a blacksmith himself. He tore down that initial blacksmith shop and built another one. And then he built a 2-story building next to that. And then he built finally a 10-room house on Diablo Road where Bevmo is now. So James got here 2 years later. He married a woman, Lillian Ramage, who had moved here with her family from Illinois. So they married and had 2 children, a young boy by the name of Clarence, but there was a twin daughter as well. And we didn't know about this for a long time until we started doing this tour. And you can see right here, there's a small gravesite right here. It says Estella. Here's what's fascinating. James, of course, knew, because he was his business relied upon the farmers here. He shoed all their horses. He actually had a building next door, and a man in that building sold farm equipment. And so it was very important for him to make sure that the farmers stayed prosperous. And remember when Miss Charlotte talked about the Grange? The Grange building still exists, and you're not going to believe it, but it's not the one over here that you're thinking about on Diablo. The original Grange was on Front Street, and it's now part of what we know as the Village Theater. So when that building was actually built and remodeled, they decided to keep the Grange building, and they simply raised it up and built underneath it. But James and many other people, including Miss Charlotte's father, the Woods, were members of the Grange. The Grange was everything that she talked about. It was a social group, but also it was a business group, and it was a political group. Well, at this time, farming was enormous around here. There were ranches, there were sheep, there was a lot of wheat being grown. There was enormous poultry farms here. As a matter of fact, it's almost half, what we're told, almost 50% of the eggs that were consumed in San Francisco came from the San Ramon Valley. Problem is, how did you get them there? Back then, we now know the boulevard. There's San Ramon Valley Boulevard, there's Harts Avenue, there's Danville Boulevard. For some of you who have maybe been around for a while, that was old Highway 21. Well, back in the day, that was a dirt road. There was a road that went out to where Miss Charlotte lived, out Tassajara and Sycamore. That was a dirt road. There were dirt roads through Alamo. But to get all this produce, to get these eggs, to get the hay out of the valley so that there was a market for it, they had to take these dirt roads basically from San Ramon all the way to Martinez. Well, think about it. In the summer, the dirt road was dusty, full of ruts. In the winter, especially in the fall during harvest, it was mud. And so they were taking all of this produce, all of these farm things that they were growing, trying to get them to Martinez, and they could only do it by horse-drawn wagons. Can you imagine? And so the growth was stymied by that. And by the time it got to Martinez, then it would get on a ferry and either go to San Francisco or make its way up to Sacramento and then further. So the Grange got together and started working with politicians, because we were a state by then, and also petitioning the Southern Pacific Railroad to bring a branch line from Martinez down through the San Ramon Valley. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was a game changer. So they finally convinced Southern Pacific to do it. Southern Pacific did not want to do it. They did not think it would be profitable, but they were finally said, okay, we will bring the railroad branch line through here. It will go from Martinez through Walnut Creek, through Alamo to Danville, actually then to what was Limerick or now San Ramon. There was going to be a turntable there and the train would go back. They said, however, we will not purchase the land for the right-of-way. So you're going to have to get together, and the Grange is going to have to convince the farmers on the route to donate the land for the right-of-way, which we now know of as what? The Iron Horse Trail. So they did. They said, however, Southern Pacific said, we will buy some land on which to put our stations. And so they purchased 8 acres in Danville from a gentleman who owned a farm here in Danville, and his name was John Hart's Avenue. So they purchased those 8 acres, and do you know where the museum is now? The museum used to sit where Lenardi's is, but that was still the same 8 acres that the original depot was built. The depot is built. John Hart's has this farm that went up the Las Trampas Hills and then east all the way well to what is now Hart's Avenue, but it divided his farm in half and really made it not really profitable to farm there anymore. So what did he do? He subdivided the land between Railroad Avenue and what is now Hart's and sold lots. And people came in and started buying those lots and building homes, and slowly but surely that became downtown Danville. Well, once the railroad came through, now all these crops, all these eggs, and could be put on a train and sent north. Also, it meant that other crops could be grown here. So pears could be grown here. So corn could be grown here. Wheat could be grown here. Walnuts could be grown here. And all of that could now have a market much larger than it ever really was. So that, the Woods family, James Close and his family, the Grange, were total game changers for the town of Danville, for the San Ramon Valley, actually, and they all came from someplace else. James' son, Clarence, who was born at the same time as Stella, did live. He married then a woman from Walnut Creek. They inherited the Close family property, and Clarence and his wife, Josephine, lived in Danville. They started and were a big part in starting the very first high school, the very first post office. They were members of the very first church, which was the Presbyterian Church, which is now the town meeting hall here in Danville. That was originally the Presbyterian Church. Clarence and his wife started the very first fire district. So do you know where Norm's restaurant is on Harts Avenue? That was the very first firehouse. Josephine was also very big in town. She helped before the high school was built in the two-story building that her father-in-law had built. On top was the school for a while, so a lot of the students who didn't go here went to school up there before the high school was built. So all these things happened, and they were, of course, very big in town. And where the fire station is now, that's where the firemen would meet. And on Saturday nights, they'd play poker there. And Josephine didn't really have anything against poker, but there are some notes in the minutes from the fire district goes, well, Miss Josephine came by again last night complaining about the noise. She didn't care so much that we were having a drink or that we were playing poker, but it was keeping her awake and she had to get up and go to church on the next morning. And of course, they were living in the 10-room house that is where Bevmo is right now. So what's fascinating about all of that is that that land where Bevmo is to this day still owned by the Close family and their relatives. Isn't that amazing? So Josephine also, and we were talking about this, Miss Charlotte couldn't vote. She also headed up the women's suffrage movement in Danville. And when California voted for the right for women to vote, she was big time in the Valley in making sure that the vote got out. Danville, as it turns out, was not real progressive at the time. And so the vote was 48 against and 23 for allowing women to vote. Fortunately, the county went the other direction and the state went the other direction. So women did indeed get what they had always deserved, which was the right to vote here in California. The point all of it is that these people, you people, and everyone came here from someplace else and made this place the place it is today.